One of those strange features from games like Skyrim, Oblivion, and Dungeons & Dragons are books, which when read boost the skills of the reader. In these games, these range from practical instructions to magic manuals to stranger books like Skyrim's The Locked Room, which is a revenge tale involving a Saw-style trap, and Oblivion's Immortal Blood, a cautionary tale about getting too full of yourself while trying to beat vampires in hand-to-hand combat. Of course, in worlds with a printing press, or with significant sermons or moral instruction, there's going to be texts designed to both entertain and educate their audience. But surely, before mass media distribution, before widespread education, and before the common people were considered important or useful enough to teach, self-help books weren't a thing. Right? Well, it may sound strange, but I believe that self-help books have existed for millennia. They're not a modern phenomenon at all. And their origins don't lie in our modern capitalist hyper-optimised society seeking to make the best of the short time we have on this earth, either. So where do self-help books come from, really? Who's writing them? What topics do they cover? And what can we learn about religion, history and society from this weirdly ancient phenomenon? The first thing to note is that by some definitions, collections of popular wisdom, like the Book of Proverbs in the Bible, could easily be considered among self-help literature. You could argue the entire Bible, a collection of moral lessons, genealogies, devotional poems, laws, proverbs, and stories about the relationship between people and the divine, might count as a sort of self-help book. It's a collection of texts intended to instruct people on how to exist as Christians or how to build a Christian community. Max Weber, a great sociologist, might use the Bible as an example of the routinization of charisma. It's a stage in the development of new religious movement where you can't just rely on a charismatic, extraordinary leader to keep the movement going. Leaders die, and although they may sometimes supposedly come back a few days later, the job of texts like the Bible, the Quran, the Guru Granth Sahib, is to ensure that the teachings, the vibrant, visible and present teachings of a specific time or a specific community are able to survive and keep instructing people for the long haul. It allows generations to come access to the thoughts and writings of these great charismatic leaders. It's why the Bible contains some of the writings of Paul, and why the Gospels are specifically named for people who were close in proximity and in time to Jesus himself, including 2 of the 12 apostles, even if they didn't write them, which they didn't. The point of such texts is to preserve the energy, the vigour and the specific thoughts of these leaders as best as possible for the years to come, which might be partly why we have a fair dearth of texts that are directly contemporary to Jesus, because he was preaching a tale of the end times coming very, very soon indeed. And so there's a bit of a gap before people start to realise, oh, we might actually need to write this down because everyone that we know who was involved in the movement is dead now. The thing is, especially in the ancient world, literacy was reserved almost exclusively for priestly classes and some very wealthy or high up people. Yes, administrative officials could sometimes fill in basic information, if they were staffing a gate or something, with a few words that they have learned to write. And some people handling official documentation may have even had the ability to read said documentation. But actual literacy, the ability to read and write anything that is put in front of you, was vanishingly rare. We're talking less than 1% throughout much of the ancient world. Books were not just written for anyone to read. In fact, for a lot of history, books were specifically written for someone, one person, one person's collection. This is because copying any text was a labour-intensive process that often required the use of someone who had been trained in that process, like the monks in Europe that we often see in scriptoria. The process of writing something down is so training and labour-intensive, really, that it is reserved for very important texts, laws, theological texts and proclamations that may be read out to the masses. Because the most economical way to get a text out to as many people as you can before the days of the printing press was essentially to write it out and then have someone perform it in a public place. Plays, proclamations, poetry and prayers are the most common forms of ancient writing for this exact reason. So this makes the self-help text even more unusual. It is not a broad piece of advice for a large swath of anyone who shows up in a town square. A self-help book is ostensibly the advice of an expert in a fairly niche topic, intended further understanding of dedicated students who already have some skill in this sphere under their belt, at least the skill to read it themselves. So now that we know how very niche self-help books of history would have had to be, and how limited their audiences were, we'll now look at some famous works of literature that look the most like modern self-help books. Before we move on to manuals, which are a specific subset of self-help books, hyper-focused on a niche subject, usually warfare. We'll discuss how both styles of these instructional self-help books come to be, and how they come to be important to their specific audiences. We're going to begin with two classic Roman authors, Cicero and Ovid, both of whom wrote on some pretty broadly applicable, even today, self-help topics, such as relationships, sex, and the way to live the best life, and friendship. These texts were written for their peers in high Roman society, and they were fairly popular literature at the time in such circles. Additionally, by the quirk of Roman society, which holds oration at such a high standard, it's very, very likely that these texts, Ovid's being specifically in poetry, would be read aloud in public, probably in smaller private gatherings, than read to the masses. Ovid's poetry is really quite special and interesting because although it's positioned as sex and relationship advice generally, the kind of classic self-help formula, Ars Amatoria is quite tongue-in-cheek. It recommends that men should not forget a woman's birthday and references the Greeks' victory in the Trojan War after 10 years of persistence as evidence that men should not give up easily on sending love letters to their beloved, even if they get no reply. His Remedia Amoris, which is written a little later, is essentially a sequel to his first book on relationship and sex advice. It's a poem essentially on how to fall out of love gracefully. He recommends avoiding wine and love poems, and also going travelling to get over a woman. Whether these are genuine recommendations, parody of common aphorisms, or somewhere in between is uncertain, but it's certainly very interesting that even some of the earliest self-help texts seem to parody the very concept of self-help. Cicero, on the other hand, was far more serious. His main self-help text that we're going to be talking about today is his treatise on friendship, discussing how to be a good friend and the virtues involved in true male friendship. It's quite sincere, and it's modelled like a dialogue, like many works of education and wisdom literature tend to be, at least in the ancient past. So what actually separates Cicero's writings from the wisdom literature parts of the Bible, which teach you how to be a virtuous person and how to have good relationships with people? What's the fundamental difference here? Is there one? Or is the Bible a self-help book? I mean, it's arguable, but I'm not convinced. So what actually separates Cicero's writings from wisdom literature, like the ancient Egyptian Sebait or the Bible? I think it would be unfair to call these texts wisdom literature necessarily self-help, but there is a slight difference between these and Cicero, which I think is worth discussing in talking about the foundations, how self-help actually begins. The main reason I'd call these Roman works self-help is because it's written for a specific audience to give specific advice in one area of their life. It's not written for a universal audience, or at least universal to everyone in a certain faith group or a certain area, to teach people how to live a godly life. The crucial difference is that these self-help books, as I'm calling them, are of a specific niche interest to a certain subset of society. Roman high society generally. There's something that these people might want to seek out to get better at, as opposed to a instruction generally so that they may generally be better at being a faithful person in the eyes of their gods. I hope that makes the distinction clear, because I believe that long before Samuel Smiley wrote his book, which was entitled Self-Help, to encourage the Victorian values of hard work, penny pinching, and developing character, specifically among social climbing working and middle class men, there were books being written long before that to advance certain skills and certain worldviews and certain ways of living among small social classes of people with a similar shared goal who may have had personal interest in achieving that shared goal outside of their obligations to the gods, or alongside their obligations to the gods. This picture becomes even clearer if we look over to manuals. Essentially, the manual is a step further in the specialisation of targeted life advice. While Ovid and Cicero were largely targeting young, educated, literate men in Roman society, manuals are often so niche in their scope that it's often really hard to find copies of them outside of the libraries of the most wealthy people of the time who were given them as gifts. I want to talk about two really key historical considerations here, because I think that there is a general historical misunderstanding by us in today's society about the purpose and function of books, which tends to make our fantasy and historical discussions far less interesting and in-depth than they could be. First things first, a book, especially before the advent of the printing press, was a work of art. Collecting books was like collecting paintings. Nobody expected you to know everything about the art you owned, just to show it off and get praise. And you weren't expected to study these things like textbooks either, because the other really important thing that we just don't consider at all nowadays is that a text was either holy, often with an obscured author. Oftentimes these holy texts were written by the divine using mortal hands or something, or it was written by someone famous. Those were the two options for a book's authorship. We touched on this earlier with the Bible, but really, to publish a book, to print a book, to make a book available to people to purchase or to have, before the printing press and movable type and it became easier to mass produce these things, it was really prohibitively difficult and expensive. Making legible text on a paper analogue was only really done for instructional, religious or cultural purposes. Cultural purposes being here proclamations, laws and things like that. And all of these publication spheres rely on the text being marketed, as it were, as the product of some specific person's ideas and personal genius. This is why texts are so often attributed to specific famous figures in history, even if it's unlikely that said figure actually wrote the text. From historical and religious figures like the Prophet Muhammad, to pseudo-historical figures like Homer, and there's even some texts that are written by entirely invented people. It's all part of the routinization of charisma that I mentioned earlier. There's only one great master to go around, so if that great master isn't in your court, your area, or your time period, the only way to get their wisdom is through this text. It may not even be an exaggeration to say that the wisdom, the personality and the charisma of the individual author was expected to be found within their text. A belief that in some part of the spirit or charisma or genius of the author ends up in the production of their work. A thought process that we could definitely make more of in our discussion of history and indeed of fantasy. Ensouled books, masters who live on in and through their texts, sentient objects of instruction, or geniuses trapped within the walls of their own book. Manuals are essentially the epitome of what we just talked about. We're going to look at 3 examples here, ranging over around 2,000 years in date of publication. King James's Basilicon d'Oron, the Royal Gift, from 1599, Fiore di Liberis, Il Fior di Battaglia, the Flower of Battle, from around 1400, and The Art of War by Sun Tzu. One is a military strategy manual, another a martial arts manual focused on wrestling and bladed dueling combat, and King James's text is an instructional manual on good kingship. All 3 are absolutely fascinating texts on their own merits, and very much worthy of further delving into, and all are really worth a good read if you haven't read them already. But what's important for our discussion today is the context of each of these texts' production. King James, the 1st of England and 6th of Scotland's text was a manual for good kingships written specifically to advise his eldest son. Given to his eldest son, and eventually given to his second son when the eldest one died. But before it was given to his second son, it was printed and published widely, bought by an awful lot of people around the country. It was sold as this interesting object written by the king to a wider readership, including a treatise on how kings are definitely chosen by God as the true authority of the land, just smuggled in there as well. I mean, honestly, this discussion of how kingship is great and everyone should love it is probably part of the reason why this book is published more broadly anyway. The text is certainly some form of political propaganda. It sets out the king's job as powerful, virtuous, Christian, and necessary. But at its core, the original text, the original royal gift, Basilicon d'Oron, is really written as an instruction manual, a piece of life advice, really, a self-help book with an audience of 1. King James's eldest son, who was intended to take over to rule him instead of Charles I. Sun Tzu's Art of War is murkier in origin. It was probably written in the 4th century BC, not the early 5th century, as is often claimed by Chinese tradition. The traditional understanding that the Art of War was a treatise written by a general who had defected to prove his worth in military strategy to the king he had defected to. It's also pretty likely that no person specifically called Sun Tzu actually existed and wrote this book, and that the name is a pseudonym used by a competent contemporary general to add to the very rapidly growing tradition in China at this time period of recording wisdom in text for people who are going to be able to read it in the future. This was a fairly new development, all things considered, in the 4th century BC. This may be why The Art of War reads as part instruction manual, part strategy guide, and part philosophy, because it is. It's an effort to add to the general corpus of Taoist philosophy, as well as being a broad instructional resource for generals of the future. It's less singular in focus, literally, than King James's one-person self-help book, but it's clearly an attempt to turn a living expert, or experts, into a more universal and timeless resource to share their knowledge with future generations, basically like the Guru Granth Sahib. And now to Fiore's The Flower of Battle, a text which absolutely exemplifies everything we've discussed so far. Fiore was a master condottieri of the time, a great duelist who was well respected, and often spent months or years at a time training up nobles around Europe for duels that they were going to be undertaking. As there was only one Fiore, and he couldn't be training everyone for dueling at the same time, especially in a very duel-happy period, multiple versions of his techniques were made into these wonderful illustrated texts in both Italian, medieval Italian, and Renaissance Latin. And they were often given as gold leaf pieces of art to the libraries and personal collections of the very rich and powerful. It was considered to be an artful distillation of the experience and the techniques of a master swordsman in swordplay, dueling and wrestling, displaying pictorially images that make it clear to us what dueling might have been like during this period in medieval Italy. Essentially, for those who could not access the real Fiore, or some other great duelist of their time, this was a handy, illustrated, if slightly gaudy, substitute. But it was an art piece as well. And it's probable that most of its owners weren't really looking to become the greatest duelist in the world or a master of battle either. It's possible that the text may have been used in training personal guards or the soldiers of its owners or something like that, used as a teaching aid for their sword masters to crib off of and get some new ideas. Kind of like a supplementary study to the study under perhaps a less famous master of education in swordsmanship. But on the whole, the pieces that we have that survive of Fiore's manuscripts are definitely display pieces. In fairness, that's probably because these were the ones that were least used and most looked after, being expensive gift items. It's very probable that there were a lot of these manuals printed fairly cheaply that were used in training of various people as supplementary to bring the great master's thoughts, opinions and charisma and skill to their students. So what does all this tell us? Well, firstly, surprisingly, self-help books are not necessarily a capitalist exploitative phenomenon, at least not at the start of their history. They were a way for people with fame and recognised skill to steer specific subsections of society in ways that they thought might be beneficial, either to society as a whole or to these people. Manuals developed this further, not just having instruction based on broad subjects like relationships or love or friendship or things like that, but detailed breakdowns of knife fighting, war fighting and being a king. And yet, even with these niche topics, people bought, copied and illustrated, spent months of their life making these texts. The libraries of wealthy people were not just filled with books to educate themselves and their children, but also art objects and transferences of charisma. Almost all of these texts that you would find in a library of some medieval count would have had a famous name on them, at least famous in a certain subject for their time. Essentially, really, the library of the past was fundamentally a collection of experts sitting on shelves, immortalised by scribes and talented artists, held in stasis as part of a collection of power, wealth, knowledge, and partly as a useful resource. We can learn from this. Our discussions of history and fantasy would be far more engaging and magical if we took this notion of what a library was to heart, what books were to heart. They were essentially a performance waiting to be read out. Oration was popular until very, very recently as a teaching method and indeed as a method of enjoyment, of living. Silent reading is a novel, modern innovation which was weird for the vast majority of history. Books were a performance of a great bard on a shelf waiting to speak their words through you. And while you were reading them, you would be imbued with the genius, the charisma, and the intellect of someone who made a name for themselves in history. Someone who knew what they were on about. Because I think we've lost that sense when we're considering now the kind of Victorian and on sense of what books can really be at all. Because let's face it, self-help books get a lot more interesting when we look at them through this specific lens, rather than as tools for increasing productivity, increasing your capital, or tidying up your bloody house. Books can be more, far more. And people of the past knew that. But with all that said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've really enjoyed this video. It's been less fantasy focused, less D&D focused than I usually go. I wanted to really talk about this specific historical sensation because it's wormed its way into my mind fairly recently. Having read some of these books, it's really quite fascinating to see how there's just a different sense of what a book could even have been or might have been able to do in history. And I do think we can benefit from thinking as people did when we're actually producing historical or fantastical or considering what the world might have been like. The best way to do so is to put your mind into the head of someone from a long time ago. A time where religion was a universal truth, acknowledged broadly, where charisma could be portrayed through text and through performance of text, and where people didn't read with their mouths closed, because that was an insane thing to do. And there's specifically a monk, I can't remember exactly who, it might have been one of the saints, who is regarded as strange and miraculous for being able to read without moving their lips. History is a different country, as they always say, but it's a country where people are still thinking and feeling and hoping and dreaming and believing in all sorts of fascinating things, and we need to give that the respect that it deserves. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I see you in the next video.